To knit a sweater, first thing that you need to do is make a gauge swatch. A gauge swatch is a piece of fabric that you make trying to match the number of stitches per inch as in the pattern. Why is making a gauge important? Well, for two reasons. First of all, any designer starts creating their design based on a gauge. In fact, some designers don't even knit a whole sweater. They just base it on this piece of fabric and then write up the pattern based on that and have sample knitters knit them up. So everything starts with a gauge. If you want a well-fitting sweater or a sweater that fits just like in the picture or how the design intended, then a gauge swatch needs to be made. Second of all, it's good to do this bit of yarn tasting, so to speak. When you make a gauge swatch and it matches the gauge, given recommended gauge, or it doesn't, you can sort of get a feel for what your fabric should be like, how the yarn behaves. You can measure it before washing and then measure it afterwards and see how much difference you get. Yeah, so it's good to get a feel for, what your fabric should feel like. And it's especially important if you're substituting yarn, to be sure that it works, that it matches the gauge, and that you like the fabric that you get. If you're wondering how many stitches to cast on, how big your gauge swatch should be, I would say the bigger the better, because stitches towards the edges of the fabric tend to stretch a bit more and not be as accurate. So I usually make my gauge swatches about 6 to 7 inches wide and 6 to 7 inches tall, just so that I could get the 4 inches in the middle and measure more accurately. So if you want to know how many stitches you should cast on, you should take a look at your pattern. For instance, in the thin pullover pattern, the gauge is 15.5 stitches. To make it easy, the gauge is 15.5 stitches to get 4 inches. To make it easy, I would think of it as 16 stitches per 4 inches, and I said we probably want to have a swatch about 6 to 7 inches. So you can go ahead and multiply 16 by, 6 inches is a 1.5 or 4 inches, right? So if you multiply 16 by 1.5, you get 24 stitches. So I would cast on about 24 to 30 stitches and try it out. And I usually make a few rows of garter, and here a couple of stitches in the border garter stitch. This is to prevent the fabric from curling. It's not a necessary thing to do. It's just I like looking at it laying flat like that, but it's absolutely not necessary. So yeah, I would say cast on 24 to 30 stitches and see what you get. The stitch gauge differs a little bit between when you knitted and after you wash and block it, because when you wash it, the fabric relaxes a bit and the stitches sort of spread out a little bit, and you want to know what your fabric will be like after it's washed, because it's a sweater, you're going to wash it. So you don't want a sweater that's going to fit right after knitting, but after you wash it, it's going to stretch out tremendously. that's why you want to make a swatch, measure your gauge, block it, and then wash and block it, and then measure your gauge. So my working gauge was 17 stitches per 4 inches. So that's like 4¼ stitches per inch. And after I washed and blocked it, I got 15½ stitches per 4 inches, which is 3¾ stitches per inch, which means that it spread out, stretched a little bit. Notice that here I have some knots tied. This is to help me remember what needle size I used to get this stitch gauge. This is very handy if you're in the US or you're used to US needle sizes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 6 knots, which means I've used the US 6 size, which is 4 millimeters. So yeah, 6 knots, US size 6. I have to say though that I am a very loose knitter. So when you see in a pattern a recommended needle size, US 6, that only means that the designer used those sizes and is recommending that size. But knitters are different. Some people knit tightly and some people knit loosely. So you should definitely swatch and try and see if you can get gauge with that needle size. And if you can't, but you're close, there is a rule that each needle size changes the gauge by ½ stitch per inch. So if you go up a needle size, you will get ½ stitch less per inch, which means your fabric will be a little looser. If you go down one size, you will get ½ stitch more per inch, which means your fabric will be a little denser. So remember that rule when you're swatching. And if you have an extra stitch, that means you need to go down or up by 2 needle sizes. Another little tip, if you're not sure how far you should work, how long you should make it, you can just, as you're knitting, you can just fold this corner to corner and see if you're getting a square, and that's usually something that helps to know that you're making a square gauge swatch. Mine is a little bit rectangular, it's a bit wide, but I knew I had enough length vertically that I didn't make it a complete square. Another thing to pay attention when you're looking at a pattern is these 2 bits of information: sizes and finished measurements. Sizes, well, what sizes, the sweater will fit. And finished measurements show how big, how wide sweater is going to be. You can also see the finished measurements in the schematic. This is a very, very important piece of information. So what can you tell from this bit of information? For instance, if you look at adult sizes, the very first size is 34-inch bust circumference. So if you have 34-inch bust circumference, you're going to follow the first number after the bracket throughout the pattern. For instance, here, yarn, the first number after the bracket is 8/8 skeins. But here's interesting information. The finished measurement for that size right here is 36 inches in bust circumference. What that means is that it's going to be loose by 2 inches around the chest, which is a standard fit for sweaters. So a sweater that fits this way, not too tight, not too loose, is called a standard fit, and it's between 2 to 4 inches around the bust circumference. So if you like this style, then you're lucky. You just go ahead and you follow the size. For instance, I happen to not be a big fan of standard fitting sweaters, just because I happen to be a very short person, and sweaters that have a little bit of space seem to make me look shorter. So I like tighter fitting sweaters. So I have a bust circumference of 35.5 inches. Well, adult sizes to fit 34, that's not me. 38, it's too big. But this is not the information I need to look at. I need to look at finished measurements, what it's going to be finished. So here, 40 inches in bust circumference, and remember mine is 35.5. That would give me 4.5 inches of looseness around my chest. By the way, looseness is referred to as positive ease in patterns. So how much looseness there is. And this one, 36, well, I'm 35.5. That only gives me 1/2 inch of looseness, which is pretty much nothing. So it will be a pretty tight fitting sweater, which is what I want. And a tight fit is usually between 2 inches of negative ease, meaning you have 2 inches less around your bust, so the fabric will have to stretch to accommodate. So between 2 inches of negative ease and I would say 1 inch of positive ease, that would be close to tight fitting sweaters. So this is the size I'm going to knit. Although my bust is not this, but I'm going to knit this size just because I want a tighter fitting sweater. While making this sweater for my husband, I had to adjust the pattern because my husband's chest is 43 inches in circumference. So if I followed this size, he would have only 1.5 inches of ease. And my husband usually wears standard fit sweaters. Like I said, those are between 2 to 4 inches of positive ease. So 1.5 didn't seem like it would be enough. Plus he has a little bit of a belly. So I thought if the sweater fit tightly, it would accentuate that belly. And I thought a bit looser fitting sweater would be better. However, if I followed this size, I would get a sweater with 48.5 inches of bust circumference. And with my husband's 43, this would be 5.5 inches of looseness around chest. And I showed examples of those sweaters to my husband, and he didn't like the fit, and he thought they were too big. So what I ended up doing was adjusting the fit. So his since his chest is 43 inches, and I needed at least 2 inches of ease, 2 inches, somewhere between 2 and 4. I decided the minimum I needed to have around chest was 45 inches. So that means that I needed to do some calculations. And in order to figure this out, I need to know my stitch gauge per inch. So my stitch gauge is 15.5 stitches per 4 inches, right? And to find 1 inch, I need to divide this number by 4, which is going to give me 388. Let's say that. And I would not discard the decimals just because, you know, those little fractions are parts of 1 inch. So when you multiply by a number like 43 inches, that's going to add up. So I would keep those decimals, and I wouldn't round it to 4 stitches. It's easier to think in terms of 4 stitches, but in actual calculations, I wouldn't round these decimals. All right, so 1 inch means 3.88 stitches. And I am going to see what that number is when I multiply it by 45. That gives me 100. So this is 174.6. So that's how many stitches I need to have around chest in order to have a minimum of 2 inches of positive ease. After I figured out the stitch gauge for this, I compared with the number I would get if I followed the pattern, and if I followed the pattern for the second to largest size, I would get 172 stitches. That's for this. That's for this size and this bust circumference. And it seemed like it's not much difference. It's only about 2 inches, 2.5 inches difference. Well, I would round this one, and that didn't seem like it would make a big difference. So I decided I would go a little bigger, and I would try 46 inches. That would give me 3 inches of positive ease. And if I multiply that by the stitch gauge, because this is our stitch gauge per inch, and I need to find out what this is going to be. And that gave me a stitch number of stitches of 180. Oops. 180. And when I looked at the largest size, that would be too big, that would give me 188. So this seemed like a midway point between the size that was too small and the size that was too big. And that would give me about 3 inches of positive ease, which I thought was perfect. Now, because this design is a top-down raglan, it's very easy to work these numbers into the pattern. Now, let me tell you that the sweater, the top part of it, the increases go at the rate of every other row. So you make increases every other row. And then for the middle part of the yoke, the increases go at the rate of every 4th row. And then there's a small section here, the 3rd section. The increases go at the rate of every other row again. There's a reason for that. It's called a compound raglan shaping, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to say that this type of shaping is supposed to fit better than regular raglan, which is all where all the increases go at every other row rate. Anyways, so if I look at this, this is a 8 stitch difference from that size that was a little too small, which means I need to work these stitches into increases. Now, if you know how raglan works, you have, if you look at it from the top down, you've got 2 sleeves here, and then you got front and back, and you make increases in 8 places. So basically every increase round you make 8 stitches of increase. But what I am interested in is the chest part, and the chest is the front and the back. So per every increase, you're increasing the chest by 4 stitches. And to make it 8 stitches bigger, it just means that I need to make 2 extra increase rounds. And what I did was I incorporated them somewhere in the middle. So the section that has every 4th row, I included 1 extra increase there, and I incorporated 1 increase in the lower section where it's every other row. I'm going to explain why. But when I did that, I got my extra 8 stitches worked into the chest. So got that. But I had to make sure that when I increased the chest, I was also increasing the sleeves, that the sleeves were proportionate and that they worked out well. So for every increase, each sleeve grew by 2 stitches. So that means the sleeve got each sleeve got 4 extra stitches, which means it's about 1 inch. So if my sleeve, the upper arm, was supposed to be 15 inches with the size that was too small, with the new sizing, it's now 1 inch. Remember, the stitch gauge is this, which is easier to think as 4. So my upper arm got wider by 1 inch, so it became 16 inches, which I thought was pretty good. So it's not out of proportion or anything. So that works. Now this measurement, this calculation works for figuring out the stitch gauge, which is sort of the horizontal measurement. Now I wanted to make sure that vertically it made sense. Initially I thought I would just add 2 increases every other row in the 3rd section. But when I was making the sweater and I following the 42-inch bust circumference size, I had separated the sleeves and body, and I worked a few rounds around chest. And when I tried it on my husband, by the way, very important, if you're knitting for someone who is who you can try the sweater on, or yourself for instance, definitely do that, because I found out that the armpit was a little too tight for him, and he actually asked for it to be an inch lower. So this section, he wanted to be a little lower like that by 1 inch. That means I need to mess with the row gauge, and that's not hard at all. So if you notice, the row gauge is 26 rows per 4 inches, and 1 inch would be 6.5 rows. To approximately, have it easier in your head, think of it as 6 rows if you're not doing the measurements precisely. So I thought I needed the yoke to be longer by 1 inch, which is about 6 to 7 rows, right? And if I made increases every other row twice, every other row means every second row twice, right? I would get 4 extra rows. That does not give me an inch of yoke depth. So I needed something between 6 to 7 rows. And that meant that I needed 1 every other row increase and 1 every 4th row increase. 4 stands for every 4th row, 2 stands for every other row increase. And that's how I came up with this adjustment. 1 increase every 4th row, the middle part, and 1 every other row increase.